So it's my pleasure to welcome Olivia Carril this morning. Olivia and I met maybe 5 years ago down at the Arc of Appalachia, and ever since we met, we connected. I've learned so much from Olivia about bees and bee identification, bee ecology. We've been lucky enough to bring Olivia back to Ohio every year except last year for the pandemic, where she leads workshops. We've done some field schools and, really get to have some hands-on experience with Olivia, learning how to identify bees in our own Ohio backyard. She, besides the book, The Bees in Your Backyard, that she co-authored with Joe Wilson, she has a new book, she and Joe, on bees of the East, Eastern US and Canada, which she's going to talk about today. She's also been on the Pollination podcast. We'll put that link into the chat box for you. If you're not familiar with that, the host, Adoni Melathopoulos, does a really great job with the podcast. Olivia has been on there. And at the end, whatever guest Adoni has, he asks them a few questions every time. And he asked, what's your favorite book? And I can't tell you how often the answer is that question, that book that Olivia and Joe wrote, The Bees in Your Backyard. It's a great resource, this amazing photography, and just really stellar natural history details to help make bee biology approachable to all of us. So at this point, Olivia, I'll turn the floor over to you. Thanks so much for being with us. We always love to learn from you.
Thanks, Denise. It's nice to be here today. And that was also really nice of you to say about our book. I hope the next one goes over as well. It comes out in July, so we have a little bit of time sort of feeling anxious and worrying and waiting while we see. So let me share my screen here. Hang on one second. It always takes 1 second to do. Almost there. Did you see I called it for Denise? This is my talk for Denise. There, how's that look, guys? Can you see it okay?
Yep, looks great.
All right, good. So I'm not going to talk a whole lot about our book that's coming out. I can give you sort of an overview of what it's going to be about so that you guys have a sense of whether that's up your alley or not. After we wrote our first book, Princeton University Press was the publisher, and they asked if we would be interested in writing a couple of follow-up books that took bee identification to the next level. The Bees in Your Backyard is kind of an overview of all of the bee genera that can be found in North America and kind of walks through some of their life history and doesn't dive into identification too much as far as that goes. And the thought was maybe to create something that was a little more like a bird field guide, something that you could take with you out into the field or in your backyard or to the park or wherever you go, and try and get a sense for the most common bees that you might see in different places, which of course was a bit of a challenge, picking which bees across the Eastern US. Whatever you find in New York is going to be pretty different from what's in Florida. But we tried to pick things that were most common, most likely to be seen, and ones that there was some reward of actually being able to identify it to species, because that can be challenging for some of the larger groups in both the Eastern and Western US. So that's what the book will be. There's, again, lots and lots of pictures, this time with little arrows pointing to important features on the bee to try and help with that identification process, and then sort of the key characteristics that distinguish it from others in the area. So we hope that it will be helpful. We look forward to feedback from everyone on what works and what doesn't. This is the first stab, as far as I know, of trying to create a guide that really gets to species level identification without being a true taxonomic key. Today, rather than talk through bee taxonomy, which didn't seem like something that we would want to do at 10 o'clock in the morning on a Thursday, I'm going to talk through a little bit about native bee populations and determining the health of them. And I'm doing this because Denise said do something that maybe interests you and that you're currently working on. And other than the bee taxonomy stuff that I do, I spend a lot of my time out trying to determine the health of bee populations here in New Mexico. I live in Santa Fe, New Mexico, through survey work. And so I wanted to give you sort of a snapshot of what it is that I'm up to and what I hope to learn from this. And my thought is that by sharing this with you all, I think the true way forward to really getting the answer to this question is by getting as many people involved as possible. And maybe you guys will be spurred to some ideas and can think about doing this in your own neck of the woods, under some sort of umbrella of other work that's going on. So with that, I'll get started. And I know you guys this week, several of you have probably already listened into some other talks about bees and wasps, which share some similar characteristics. And so I'm not going to dive too much into basic bee biology, except to give you a bit of an overview of what a native solitary bee is, because that's where my focus will be today. These differ from honeybees in that they live solitarily. So each individual female goes out and gathers pollen and nectar that she brings back to a nest that she's built, usually by herself. And she drops off all that pollen and nectar in there in a little tiny cell that she creates for an egg that she lays. So she functions in the same way that both queens and workers do, all crammed into the same body in a solitary bee. So there's no hives, there's just these little tiny nests. Most of them are in the ground. In the West, where I am, about 70% of them nest in the ground. Some are in twigs or pieces of rotting wood or snail shells or holes in rocks and all of these things. But the vast majority of them dig a hole in the ground, put a bunch of pollen in there, put an egg in, and then repeat the process many, many times. So that's what a solitary bee is. They're very diverse, whereas there's just the one honeybee species, Apis mellifera. We think that in the US, there's somewhere between 3,500 and 4,000 different species of native solitary bees, and a few non-native bees in North America. These guys collect pollen. So unlike a lot of the other insects that visit flowers, they're usually visiting for nectar, whereas bees are actively rummaging around in the flower, gathering up as much pollen as they can, packing it onto special spots on their bodies and hauling it away. So this makes them very efficient and effective pollinators because they're so focused on the pollen, there's more of a chance that they're going to be in it and that some of those pollen grains will accidentally be left on another flower somewhere and pollination will occur. And the other really cool thing about these is that many, many species can co-occur. So 1 acre may have 20 to 50 different species, all just in that one tiny little spot. There's a lot of diversity even at the very small scale. So in a way, if you think about this, this is similar to a flowering plant community. Flowering plant communities also have a lot of species that are all together and they all have their different life histories and they're kind of patchy, right? You see a purple flower next to a yellow one, there's a white one somewhere in there and they change over the season. So they're kind of plant communities that are short-lived. What you see in the spring is different from what's in the summer and in the fall. And which flowers are in these areas and how many of different kinds of flowers changes naturally from year to year. So bees are very similar to this. They have a similar sort of characteristic on the landscape in that they are patchy and short-lived and how many there are changes from year to year. With the added component, these guys move. They move day to day, they move hour to hour, they're constantly moving, and from year to year, they can up and move to a brand new area. So when we're talking about health of bee populations, we have to consider all of these characteristics of the bees in order to determine what's actually going on there. So in order to talk about this, I need to make sure that you understand what I mean when I say a bee population. So this is a community of bee species that live in an area together. An area can be defined in any number of different ways. It could be a habitat, it could be a landscape patch, it could be your backyard, it could be just the bees that are in a bee house. Any area as you define it, it's the community of bees in that area. And some component of this community changes over time, over the season, et cetera, and maybe even between your backyard and that of your friend that lives down the block. So let me give you an example of this. If I were to talk about a bee community, a bee population, I might talk about the number of species that are in an area. So I've put together a list of bees that I might find in my area. And I said, okay, there's 7 species that live in my area. That's one way we can talk about bee populations. But we can add on to this the number of individuals. How many of each of those species do we find in an area? So in my example here, the sweat bee was super common, whereas one of the digger bees, Anthophora edwardsii, maybe not so common, not as frequently seen. And then we can look at this over time. So in 2010, maybe there was a certain number of bees, but in 2011, things changed a little bit. Anthophora edwardsii tripled in size, so there were 3 times as many, but Diadasia diminuta didn't show up in my yard in 2011, even though it was there in 2010. This can be very natural. It doesn't necessarily mean there's a decline in this species. I'd need a lot more data to really get at that, but they can sort of change over time from year to year. And they can change over space. Like I said a minute ago, if I compare my yard to that of someone who lives a few miles away, I might find that some things are equally abundant in both places, but that other ones are more abundant in my yard and less abundant in somebody else's. So what do we know about these bee populations already? From my point of view, as a scientist who loves data and is always trying to collect data, we don't know as much as we need to. Some of the questions that we want to answer about bees require more data about bee populations than we currently have. So let me give you sort of an overview, and some of this I'm sure you already know. We think that in the world, there's somewhere between 20 and 30,000 different bee species. We're not really sure how many. There are some areas of the world that haven't been well sampled. New species haven't been described and added to this number, so we kind of cap it at either end. We know there's more than 20,000. We estimate maybe up to 30,000. In the US and Canada combined together, we think there's between 3,500 and 4,000. This number changes a little bit from year to year as we change the names and identities of different bee species. But overall, we think there's somewhere in there. If we sort of compare and figure out where these bees are in the United States, east of the Mississippi River, it's been found, papers have reported about 770 bee species occurring there. So just for comparison, just to give you a sense of the diversity here, there are about 1,100 birds in all of North America. So in the eastern US, compared to all birds in North America, it's pretty diverse. So if we break that down by our different states, we see sort of this general trend that states in the north usually have fewer bees than states in the south for the same longitude. And as we move from east to west across the US, we also find that bee species richness increases, so that by the time we get to the southwest where I live, bee species richness is actually quite high. And just to make sure this is, that you understand how patchy and sort of broken up this is, like the scale that we should really be looking at, I added a little arrow on here. There's an area right down here on the Colorado Plateau in south central Utah where I did my master's work. And in just this area, this tiny little spot there, compared to the size of the whole US, we found 660 bee species. So almost as many as all of Eastern North America. So this is an interesting way to sort of think about bees, and at what scale do we look to figure out how diverse and abundant they are in different places. Another way that we can look at this is to look at the number of genera of these different kinds of bees. So when you think of a bee, we give it a name that has both a genus component and then a species part. So Bombus is the genus, and then Bombus terricola, of course, would be the genus species name. So if we look at the number of genera, Bombus, Osmia, Anthophora, Anthidium, Dianthidium, et cetera, we find that the areas of the North America that have the greatest generic richness are in the southwest, sort of the Chihuahuan and Sonoran deserts, extending down into Mexico, where they get some bees that are sort of at the edge of the tropics there. So a lot of overlap in different genera that drop out and come in from North and Central America. If we look at species richness, it shifts just a little bit. The greatest number of species has been recorded in the ecoregion that is the Great Basin and Colorado Plateau. This might be partly a result of sampling, how much sampling has been done in these different areas, but it might also have to do with the fact that there's a very long growing season there and several sort of endemic things happening in those regions. So are these bee populations in decline? One of the reasons that we want to study bee populations is so that we can answer questions about who needs our help, which bees seem to be most affected by things that are happening in the world today. So I'm just going to show you 3 studies that show different approaches for trying to answer this rather complicated question. You may have heard about some of these. Some of them are a little more well reported than others and have been around longer. This one is specifically focused on the bumblebees. So one way that we can answer the question of whether bees are in decline is to look at one kind of bee and see how just that very small little tiny group of all of the bees might be doing. And so several scientists did this not too many years ago. I think this was about a decade ago now. And they looked just at bombus, and there's 45 bumblebee species, give or take, in North America. And they focused in on just 8 of them, for which there was a fair amount of data. And they looked at where colonies had been found in the past and where colonies were found in the present day to see if there were any shifts in the geographic range or in the abundance of these bees. And they found 4 species in total that were in decline, 2 in the west and 2 in the east. So that's where the black bar is higher than the gray bar. So past records compared to present records. Bombus occidentalis is one that is of interest in the West right now, and there's a lot of work being done to kind of figure out where populations of it are right now, and where it may have been historically and isn't at the moment. And in the East, you guys have probably heard about Bombus affinis as a bee that is in serious decline and isn't seen nearly as often as it used to be. But at the same time, in this same data set, they also found 4 species that are increasing in abundance, that are more common than they were historically and have greater geographic ranges. Among these in the east are ones that you're probably familiar with. They're not that uncommon at all. Bombus bimaculatus and Bombus impatiens are both becoming more common, more frequently found, and don't seem to be too affected by urbanization and things like that. So here's another paper, and I'll kind of summarize all of this here at the end. Here's another interesting paper that was published also about a decade ago. Some of these are older. I have a few newer ones in here too. And these people instead looked at historic records. So they went back to the beginning of all bee species that had been collected in Eastern North America. And they made a list of all of the bees that were there. And then they looked to see which of those bees that have historically been recorded are still present today. So how has bee species richness changed based on presence and absence data? And they had a lot of records to look at. They had millions of records. If you look here, this is the estimated size of the bee collection in terms of number of specimens. So they had quite a few specimens to look at. And these are the people that came up with that number of 770 bee species occurring in Eastern North America. This is where I get that number. And they found 95% of those bee species that were present prior to 1990 are still there. And the 5% that weren't there, about 37 species, were rare prior to 1990 and kind of on the edge of their range. They're more Midwestern or Western species, and maybe were never really that common in Eastern North America. It's interesting to note that for this study, the only thing they could do is sort of qualify whether the bee was there. So presence, absence means yes or no. If there was a bee that was present before and is still present, but there were 10,000 of them back before 1990, and now there's only 2, that would still show up as a yes and a yes, even though the number of them had dropped really significantly. So there's only so much we can say with the data set like that. This one is a little more interesting. They tried a different approach to get at how bee populations have changed over time. And based on the wonderful records of a man named Charles Robertson, who collected and observed bees in the 1890s outside of Carlinville, Illinois, they went back to the same area where he had done all of these collections and recording of bee flower relationships to see if the bee flower relationships that they found were the same as the ones that he had found. So they picked 26 of the many flowers that he had looked at and went back to those and sampled bees on them to see if the same bees were still on those plants. And they created something that's kind of complicated. It seems like a lot to look at here at the start, but I can walk you through it. It's, I think, rather beautiful and kind of neat to look at. On the left side are the 26 plant species that they studied. And on the right side are the bees that either Charles Robertson or these particular authors, these scientists, found on those plants. And the red bars on the right side indicate a bee that was no longer found. So it wasn't found visiting the plants that Charles Robertson had found it visiting. The blue lines in there are new relationships. So bees visiting flowers that he didn't record. The red lines are relationships that he recorded that they didn't. And black lines are ones that stayed the same. So to summarize that rather complicated web there, they found 109 bee species, but only 24% of the original linkages persisted. So of the 532 interactions that he had found, 407 were no longer there. And in all cases, because they picked the plants, this had to be because the bee wasn't there anymore. What's important to know about this study is what this tells us is that bees have shifted from the plants that they were visiting because they didn't sample the whole community of everything. And maybe there's now an invasive plant that wasn't there when Charles Robertson did his work, and many of these bees have shifted over and are getting their pollen there. We don't know that those bees are absent from the community. We just know that they're not visiting the plants that they were visiting historically. And along those same lines, this interesting one looked to see if there were changes in sort of the community composition. So we can think of this in terms of almost guilds of bees. So big bees and small bees, specialists and generalists, ground nesters and twig nesters, those sorts of things. Are there changes in the community composition in areas that have become more urbanized over the last 100 years or so? So these people compiled data to look at that, and they found some interesting and rather significant shifts in community composition, but very few huge declines in bees outside of bombus, which we've already talked about. They found that specialist bees that fly for short periods of time have a really narrow sort of flight window, and bees with a large body size are the ones most likely to change over time as landscapes are modified. And then the final one that I'll talk about is this rather recent one this came out in January of this year. It's a very recent paper, and I thought they did a great job of summarizing a whole lot of data. They pulled up a website called GBIF. If you guys are interested in GBIF, it has data for so many different organisms, including a lot of bee records for different states and different ecoregions and different species. And no matter how you slice it, they have a way to show you data on these things. And they noticed that, and you can kind of see it in the blue and red lines in the top left there. The number of bee specimens, the number of individuals that's been collected has increased from 2000 to 2000. I don't remember what year they cut it off, at least through 2010. But the number of species that's been found among that huge number of specimens that we have is actually smaller, has shrunk. And they offer several possible reasons why this is and suggest that we do some more research. One of the interesting things that they point out, and I'm going to bring this up again later, is that perhaps the way that we're collecting bees might result in more specimens, but that way may also limit which kinds of species we get. And so there may be sort of an issue there with our collection method. So if we were to try and summarize all of that together, I think the big picture is that landscape level changes in the last 75 years are definitely influencing bees. It's in many cases, it may be detrimental to bees. We know that a few are losing. We've documented that for sure with some bombus species. Chances are good that more than just a couple bombus species are also winning, are becoming more abundant, and are adapting well to these landscape changes. There's some evidence to suggest that bees actually do well with a modest amount of disturbance. So a study that came out not too long ago looked to see sort of bee responses overall to different anthropogenic disturbances, including things like grazing, logging. What else did they look at? Maybe burning and some other different things. And they found that there were certain kinds of disturbances where bee species abundance and richness both increased, and a few where there were some pretty serious declines because of those changes. Habitat fragmentation was one that seems to overall, no matter where you go, not be so good for bees. So that's just a little hint there that maybe planting bee-friendly flowers in your yard, which would minimize habitat fragmentation, might be a good idea. Okay, so how do we solve this problem? How do we gather the baseline data that we need in order to answer these questions? Almost all of those papers that I mentioned say at the end, we need more research, we need more baseline data, we need a way to get past the fact that we didn't collect baseline data a long time ago, and so it's hard for us to answer those questions now. This is controversial. It's not as easy as you might think to collect this. A bunch of rather famous bee scientists all came together and wrote this paper about how important it is to detect these declines on both regional and global scales, and that we need to be putting money into this. And there was a paper that came out right after that that kind of said, you know what, that's just a bad idea. Going around with a net or pan traps or whatever and madly collecting bees is going to diminish bee populations, and we're probably not going to get a whole lot out of it. And so we're squandering money and also the bees that are out there. Of course, they had a follow-up paper that said, well, we really need that baseline data though. So, I mean, what do you suggest? If we want to learn about bees, we kind of have to do this thing. And then you add on to that the fact that there's some issues about how to collect these bees. What sort of methodology should we be using in order to determine which bees are where and how many there are? A recent paper suggested that maybe one of the methods that's been widely used by bee scientists for the last 20 years isn't so effective and maybe ends up with more bycatch and more bees that we don't want than is worth it. All of which is to say that 20 years later, we're still trying to figure out the best way to monitor these bees and trying to figure out if there's a way to combine all of our efforts of scientists all around North America and the world in a way that helps us answer these questions. So let me walk you through this is the problem. Here is the crux of the issue. So imagine for a minute that we want to figure out how many bee species are in an area. Obviously, to figure that out, we collect a number of specimens, and the more specimens we collect, the closer we are to that actual real number. So this green line represents how many bees are actually in my backyard. Let's say it's my backyard. And if I go out on the first day and I madly collect with a net and I document all of these bees on different things, I'm going to get closer to that answer. So now I know that there's, say, 25 bee species in my backyard. And if I go out next week and do that again, I'm going to double the number of bees. Now I know there's 50 bee species in my backyard because I've collected more specimens, and some of the rarer ones that I missed or didn't see that first time are now there. And of course, if I continue this over a season, so I get everything from spring to fall, slowly but surely, I'm going to inch my way towards that line. But notice that there's a sort of a slope, sort of a drop off in the number of new discoveries as I collect more and more specimens. I'm going to continue to get the really common things. If any of you that are birders, you can think of this in the same way that the more time you spend out, the more likely you are to find that really rare and exciting bird. But you have to get past all of the European starlings and American robins and other things that you see every time you go. So same thing with bees. We're trying to inch our way towards that line. And the goal is to stop right about there so that we've collected the amount that we need without over collecting an area, without having too much data to process that isn't actually informative. And that is the trick right there. This is made especially difficult by the fact that the number of bee species that are in an area can change from year to year. Maybe in one year it's higher, maybe the next year because of poor resources, the previous year there's less bees. Maybe a new plant came in, maybe it's an invasive species, who knows? The number of bee species changes from year to year, and it's a moving target to try and get to that true number of what is in this area. This is also made more difficult by the fact that depending on how we collect that data, we may end up with not being able to get to the true number. So to give you an example, with pan traps, we get a lot of really great data early on. We don't have to collect too much. We don't have to put too much effort in and get too many specimens to get a fair idea of what's in an area. But pan traps don't collect all kinds of bees. So at some point, some of these techniques that we use don't capture the full diversity of what's there. And we need to think about that when we're using these. So how to answer this question? This is what I've spent the last sort of I don't know, 20 years or so trying to figure out. These are studies that I was involved in when I worked with the USDA Pollinating Insects Research Unit, which is based out of Logan, Utah, and has done a lot of really large-scale bee surveys and gave me a sense for how we might try and answer some of these questions. And I've taken what I learned there and applied it to areas here in New Mexico, which has been very poorly sampled for the last 100 years, trying to figure out what bees are here and how bee populations in these areas are doing. So I want to walk you through some of the interesting things that we've found from having this baseline data and how it can be useful and important and why we do these sorts of things. So I'm gonna show you a couple of the old studies and then talk through some that I'm working on right now. So to begin with, the first study, the one that I cut my teeth on, if you will, when I was really young, much younger than I am now, was in Pinnacles National Monument. This is a place in California. This is where I caught my first bee ever, a honeybee of all things. And I worked out there from 1996 to 1999, camping and collecting bees with the net as I walked around on trails. And from that work, we found 393 species in 52 genera. What's remarkable about this is the area at the time that I was surveying it was about 5 miles by 5 miles square. So it's a very, very small area, about 25 square miles in this whole region. And it had 393 different species. Pretty incredible. The flowering season out there starts in February, so right around Valentine's Day, and runs through maybe the end of May. And then it kind of dries up until the fall when there's another suite of flowers that comes out with bees related to them. So a graduate student came along after I had finished up my work on this and moved on to other things and re-sampled that area. Pinnacles added a little extra territory to the national monument. I believe it's even a national park now. And with that, they added more species. So now in the area, there's 450 bee species in 53 genera. So this is the part that I want to focus on that I think is really interesting. If you look at which bees were collected in each year and how that changes over time, this is what we find. So in order to do this, we use a method called a similarity index, and it goes from 0 to 1. If the number is 0, it means there were no species in common. So one year we got parrots and one year we got polar bears, totally separate things. If the number is 1, it means that even down to the number of individuals that were collected, it stayed the same every year. So we collected 100 bumblebee Bombus occidentalis in 1 year and 100 the next and 100 the next. That would get us towards that number that is a 1. So we looked at that for Pinnacles National Monument because we have this incredible data set that spans so many years. And you can see, looking at the top, see there's a dashed line, a sort of a diagonal that runs. Look to the top and to the right of that. And from 1996, if we compare that to 1997, we have a value of 0.68, which is closer to 1 than 0, and means that more species were in common between those 2 years than not. 0.64 the next year, 0.71, 0.52, 0.63, 0.61. If you look and kind of examine that square as a whole, you can see that there is some natural species change no matter which 2 years you look at, but by and large, the number of species and who those species are seems to say the same, more or less. If you look at the number of genera, or the similarity of the genera, which is the area down below and to the left, you can see that there's very little change. Bombus is there every year. So the difference is which Bombus species we were collecting in those years. Anthidium is there every year, but which Anthidium species we were finding changes from year to year. So point being, there is some natural variation in these bee populations in a national park, a national monument, which is well protected, spanning all of these years. We do see some natural shifts, very subtle, very little, from year to year. So now let me look at another place that I studied prior to moving to New Mexico. This is where I worked for my master's. It was a Grand Staircase Escalante National Monument was a large monument that had just been established, and there was this big push to do a lot of research in this place. And so we wrote a proposal to Grand Staircase asking if among the research, all of the dinosaur stuff that they wanted to do, they might want to learn about their bees in this area that had never been studied as far as bee species richness and diversity before. And our proposal got funding, and so we headed down with a large crew of people to kind of get a sense of what bees were there. And we collected throughout this region if you drive from north to south, it's about 50 miles, and from east to west is about 100 miles. So it's about, at the time of that I did my surveys, it was about 2 million acres. It's huge. So all of the little yellow squares there are places where I collected in a standardized way. So based on what I'd done in Pinnacles, where I collected on these trails, and it was really hard for me to compare a trail segment to a trail segment, I created a standardized 1 hectare, so 100 meter by 100 meter block that I would collect that same space every 2 weeks for the duration of the flowering season in a standardized way for a standardized period of time, so that then I could really compare what was in that plot over a period of time and see what changes were happening, both across the season and also between years or between locations. How does sagebrush on this end of the monument compare to sagebrush on the other end? And so that's what those little yellow squares are. I had 48 total plots that we collected, as well as all of those other collecting sites. And in the end, that got us that 660 bee species that I talked about early on. Overall, over a 4-year period on this 2 million acre place, we collected 80,000 individuals, 80,000 specimens of bees, which sounds like a lot, but it's really, it equates to, what is it? Something like 1 bee per 4 acres per 4 years. Or 2 acres? Anyway, not very much. We collected for a total of 1,632 days. So we got a pretty good sample. We're pretty far along on that species effort curve there. And many of those species, 72% of the species that we collected were in those plots. So the plots actually served to document what was on this landscape fairly well. About 3/4 of all of the species in the monument were within a plot. So that was nice. But the really cool thing that I want to share with you today is this graph, which is similar to that one I showed you early on that was that plant pollinator network with the blue and red lines. And what this is showing is which flowers bees were visiting during each of my collecting periods for one plot. So I collected this particular plot in early May, then late May, early June, then late June in the years 2001, 2002, and 2003. And you can see that the plant pollinator network very naturally seems to shift from year to year, so that in one year, a particular plant might be especially good for bees, and in another year, maybe there's not so much on it. I find these natural variation things very interesting because they put in my mind this sort of caveat that I need to keep in mind when I come to conclusions about what bees are in an area, because I need to account for that variation that's in there. So now, currently, I'm wrapping up a study that I did here in northern New Mexico, another really large area called Rio Grande del Norte National Monument. We visited many sites over here, and I'm still wrapping up the data, but I'm getting pretty close with the plot data. So again, I set up several plots that we visit every month to figure out what bees are there and sort of get an idea for trends over time. But in this area, in addition to figuring out trends over time, the other thing that we really wanted to see was how landscape level management techniques that the BLM employs might be important to bee species richness. So we're doing comparisons between different sorts of plants. So to give you a sense of what I mean, I have a plot that's dominated by 2 plants, 2 tree species, one called pinyon, one called juniper. And the pinyon juniper plot I'm comparing to a pinyon juniper plot that was recently burned. So the overstory has been removed, but it's still the same sort of habitat, or was originally. And similarly, I have a plot that's all sagebrush and another one that's sagebrush where grazing occurs fairly regularly. So I've collected in a standardized way, and using that data, I can now look to see how the bees differ between these different sort of landscape level techniques here. And interestingly, I've found my most productive sites are, of course, the riparian one, because even in a dry year, which happens here in New Mexico more often than I wish it did, there's always plants in riparian areas. And so I can be guaranteed to find bees there no matter what. I find that my burned plots, the areas that have burned, I think partly because there's no overstory and partly because of the release of nutrients that happens after that burn and all that area material is decomposing, and all of the habitat that you create with those dead trees that are slowly breaking apart for twig nesting and cavity nesting bees. My burned sites are quite prolific. I get a lot of species, I get a lot of specimens. Unburned is okay. And so here's the other thing is now I can compare a pinyon juniper that hasn't been changed in any way to a sagebrush to a riparian. Sagebrush, it does about the same as pinyon juniper, but the grazed, which has a moderate level of disturbance in it, seems to not affect the bees as much as you might think it would, which is kind of interesting. The thing that I've had to get used to as I work my way through all of these areas is to remember that even though on the whole bee species richness is quite high in many of these areas, there are a lot of areas that are just big fat zeros. I go out sometimes and spend an hour standing in one of my plots really hoping to collect a bee and not finding a single plant or a single bee. And that also is data, which areas don't have bees. And then of course, as I stand there, I start to wonder if it might have something to do with some of the disturbance that's happening or whether that matters at all. And I don't know, remains to be seen. All of my specimens that I get when I take them back home, I pin them up, I put them all with little tiny barcodes. So now this information ends up in a giant database and can be used to analyze questions now or questions that someone thinks up in the future. And of course, I try and identify them to species, which brings up the final sort of hurdle that these bee studies have, which is the identification process. So I wrote the book that kind of helps some people that don't have a lot of bee experience get a handle on identifying some of these bees. But as I worked my way through that book, I just kept coming back to the problem that we are giant and bees are very small, and the features that tell them apart from our point of view are so minuscule and so hard to really see without lots and lots of specimens and lots of time. It is a real trick to identify a lot of these things to species level. Once you get past the really obvious and easy ones like the bald eagle, that one's not so bad, but some of the other ones are a little trickier. And training the next, inspiring and encouraging the next generation of taxonomists is really going to be key to getting through this problem of figuring out what bee populations are doing and what bee population health is like. So to sort of summarize what my goals are with this, my goal is to sort of find an efficient way to collect data that helps us understand bee populations for the long term, to create an efficient way to get that baseline data that we need in order to figure out who the winners and who the losers are going to be. I want to create this baseline for future land managers and also for future scientists. And I want to figure out which of the land management practices, especially here on public lands, which are such a big deal in the West, might be influencing bees one way or another. It seems to me that maybe a moderate level of disturbance is reasonable, isn't too bad for the bees. And then I want to make sure that this survey method, whatever we come up with, that it is something that's usable and can be used by other people, including other citizen scientists that might want to work on bees on their own in the future. And so I'll quit right there and answer any questions that anyone might have about bees and bee surveys and identifying bees and anything else you might have.
All right, great. Olivia, thanks so much. So one of the first questions that came up was, can you define Eastern versus Western?
Yeah, that's a hard question. When we wrote our book, The Common Bees of Eastern North America, the question was where to draw the line. And we more or less decided to draw it at the Mississippi River, but there is definitely some overlap. Some of the Midwestern bees, I mean, God, you're borderline Eastern there, but for all intents and purposes, for when I talk about things, I kind of draw the line at the Mississippi River.
Okay. There was also a question about whether you and Joe have in mind to work on a Western book.
I will be working on it the rest of today. Yes. Yeah, it will be out sometime, maybe a year or so from now. We should have that one done and off to Princeton.
Awesome. And so there were, I tried to kind of group our questions together. So there are lots of questions about stem nesting bees. Heather Holm talked earlier this week about how to clean up debris so that you're, conserving those bees, but also if you want to tidy the garden. And so maybe could you review, kind of maybe pick a species, review quickly the life cycle, and then how to manage some of those bees for habitat?
Sure. Let's see which species to pick. This is hard. Let's pick 2 or 3. So the 3 big ones that come to my mind right away are some of your mason bees, which live in the slightly larger holes, and then small carpenter bees are twig nesters, and then the hyleas, the, what do we call them, yellow face bees, are also nest in really, really small holes. All of them are opportunistic, and any sort of hole that you can provide is fine by them as long as it's the right diameter. Some of them are really picky about how deep that twig is that they choose to nest in. Out where I am, we did a fun thing where you take a piece of mud and use your finger to poke some holes in it and then let it dry. And that actually will serve as bee nesting habitat for some of these guys. So it doesn't necessarily have to be anything too fancy. The goal is to provide cavities of different sizes. And the life history varies dramatically depending on which one you're talking about, but the general life history for a bee like this might be, say for a mason bee, it comes out in the spring as an adult. The adult males usually emerge first, followed by those females, and the females immediately start gathering pollen and nectar that they bring back to whatever nest site they've decided is good enough, and deposit it in little tiny nurseries, one after another, sort of stacked together inside that twig or cavity, whatever it is. And then she caps that off. Maybe she'll do 2 or 3 of those, depending on how long she has before her very short adult life span is over. And then those little tiny eggs hatch within just a couple days, even before the mother is dead. But she sealed it off and never gets to see those little offspring. So that egg hatches, and the larva that comes out munches on that pollen and devours the whole thing, and then goes through sort of a pupating stage where it transitions from the larva into a full-on adult. Many of the osmia will overwinter in an almost adult phase so that they can emerge very early in the spring and continue on. And then they sort of wait. So after they've eaten the pollen, after they've started that pupation process, they'll wait until the following year when conditions are right, when it seems warm enough and wet enough and whatever it is that they cue in on, to emerge from that nest as an adult and begin the process over again. So this probably differs depending on where in the country you live and which sorts of bees you're dealing with. But for much of the East, I would say larger size holes are probably where you should put your efforts in. So creating something using either pre-made straws that are appropriate for bees, you can buy them online from a number of sites, or bamboo or something like that, can create a really nice little bee home that you can put up and kind of watch the bees. Know that over time, those bees are probably going to start attracting other little parasites and parasitoids and things like that to the same nesting site. In nature, naturally, these bees would probably nest in a spot one year and then the next year move on to a new location. So it was harder for the parasite load to sort of build up. But when we create those bee houses for them, we're encouraging them to re-nest in the same spot, and the parasite load can get a little bit higher. And so either move your home or clean it out if you want from time to time, so that the bee remains the dominant species in there and not the parasites.
Okay, good. So Val had kind of a related question. She asked if bees are more likely to lay eggs in growing stems or in the cut stems.
You mean cut?
So I think of like a goldenrod. If you leave that stem up over winter with the flower head, are bees nesting in there, or how does that work with cleanup?
Right. It depends on the plant. So some of them become more hollow and are easier for the bee to kind of chew into and create a home later in the year. So after the greening has gone, so to speak. Think about this from the point of view of a completely unmanicured lawn, right? So you have these stems, and they're going to dry out, and the heads are going to fall off, and next year they're just going to be sort of these wobbly, wavery little bits of stem with the heads gone, sort of hanging out in an area. Or even if the head's not gone, sort of dried out stems. And those are the ones that the bees that come out in that second year are going to find and re-nest in. So dried out, yeah, I would leave the dried out stems as much as possible. I think those are definitely more often used than the really green ones that still have like sap in them and other resiny things that are hard for bees to nest in.
There are a number of questions about photography and how you prepare your samples. Someone wanted to know if cooling bees down to photograph them will harm them. Maybe you can talk about, just overview of your collecting methods, photography methods, and the ethics of collecting.
Sure. Yes, I can talk about those. Remind me if I missed what you said.
I know.
I'll start with the photography. So bee photography is so much easier in the digital age than it was before. And the reason is bees don't hold still and flowers are always blowing in the wind, and macro photography requires this very narrow depth of field. But that has to be in focus. And so it can be tricky to get those pictures the way you want them in the field. I find that patience and 10,000 shots is the way to get the one that you want. So sitting in a spot and click, 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 and one of those will hopefully turn out to be okay. But if you get too frustrated and it's not working for you, collecting one of those bees and a flower that you can put in a vase is totally okay. There's nothing wrong with that. Bees can handle a small amount of cooling. It depends on the species. Some seem to cool, chill really nicely and come back with no problem. Others seem to take it a little harder and don't do quite as well. Bumblebees do great. Nomada do really good. Some of the kleptoparasites seem to do really well. And the amount of time that you have after you've cooled them before they come to and fly away also seems to differ. So with practice, you'll figure out how each of these little bees differs. But generally speaking, sticking something in the fridge for a half an hour, totally fine. Maybe even quite enough time for a few. You might even want to go a little longer, but I just put them in a Tupperware, leave them in the fridge for a bit, get my flower, set up the scene that I want or whatever, and then pull the bee out and set it on the flower. And this is the hard part because it'll look like it's completely dead. It'll be all curled up. It won't want to hang on to the flower. You have to wait till it starts to get a little warmer again. And as soon as it does, set it on the flower and it'll hang on to the flower while it buzzes its wings and starts to warm up. And you wait then for that moment, that split second. You have about 10 seconds where it's going to look alert and active and normal before it flies away again. And then you have to catch it and refrigerate it if you need to. But that's kind of the gist if you want to take that approach. But either way, it requires patience and taking a whole lot of pictures to get that right one. Then bee collecting, the ethics of bee collecting. I think you can.
Go ahead. Well, let me read it. So Laura says, especially when working with educating youngsters, getting them excited about insects, does hobby collecting impact bee populations?
We don't have enough data to say for sure, but my gut reaction is probably not. Hobby collecting usually isn't on a very large scale. It's not covering more than just a small area. And hobby collecting, even for a hobbyist, they don't really want 10,000 of one. They're trying to get one individual of this bee and one of this and one of this. So generally speaking, I would say no. Hobby collecting does more good than harm because it excites people. It inspires them to go out and look for more and to take pictures and share what they've learned. And I think there's a lot more to be gained from that very minimal excitement of collecting from a few people that are out doing that. Now, when you get to the level of collecting 10,000 of something in one small little area, yeah, I think that, of course, that's going to have an impact. That would have to. Did I answer the question? I think I did.
I think so.
Okay.
How do you find ground nesting bee nests?
I seldom do. They're so hard to find. It's always really exciting when I do. The easiest ones to find are the ones that nest in aggregations. So they're sort of gregarious and there will be 10 or 100 of these bees all nesting in the same area. And then it becomes more obvious that they're there. Other than that, for me, it's always been being outside as much as possible and just kind of looking at the ground a lot. That's what I do. And when you do, you'll see this movement of something. And sure enough, it's a bee headed into its home. I've never been able to follow a bee back to its nest or anything like that. It's always just happenstance that I look down at the ground at the right time and see something going into a nest. I can never tell a nest either. If I see a hole in the ground, unless you see the bee go into it, you really can't tell that it's a nest.
Okay, Debbie asked, what time of year do the solitary bees lay eggs? And maybe you could answer this from our, kind of perspective of, we have participants from the Southeast and the Northeast and from the West, and how can we look at that question in a broad way?
Yeah, so this is a really good question. And I'm going to start by saying that it helps to start to think of bees in the same way that you think of the produce that you find in your grocery store. So when you go to the grocery store, in the spring is when you find asparagus is starting to be in the grocery store, and it's not those thick, yucky stems anymore. And then as the season goes on, then you start to see apples and watermelons are always there right around the 4th of July. And later on, it's squashes, and there's a seasonality to all of these things. There's a seasonality to bees too. So which bees are active depends entirely on the time of year that you're looking. So the bees that are out in the spring are very, very different from the bees in the summer and the bees in the fall. There's a few species that are not completely solitary, that sort of are this undercurrent and appear to be around all of the time. But generally speaking, the bees that you're going to see in your backyard will be there when you're out in May and not when you're out in June. So when bees lay their eggs is when they are adults and flying around, and it's going to differ depending on which bee species we're talking about. So when someone comes to me and says, I saw this yellow and black bee on some kind of plant and I was wondering what it is, oftentimes my first question is, what time of year were you looking? Because that can be so helpful in figuring out which bee we're talking about, because they're so different from season to season. In the Southeast, there are a lot of species that in the north cut off in the sort of maybe September, October. The bees are done, and you don't see any bees until the following year in March, April, May, depending on how far north you are. Whereas in the South, those same species may have a much longer season, and you're likely to see them from, say, February through November. And that's true in California from north to south. That's true where I am as well. And of course, elevation plays into that too. Higher elevation sites you're not going to see bees as early either.
Do you have some general tips on how folks can differentiate bees from wasps?
Yeah. Let's see. So the important thing when it comes to thinking about a bee versus a wasp is to first remember what the life history and what the goal of these two creatures is, and to realize that the way that they look is very much a result of what they do all day long, right? And so a wasp is a meat eater. They are predators. They're out there to grab a cricket or something and take it back to their nest to feed to their offspring. Whereas the bees have given up the meat-eating lifestyle and are, by and large, except for just a couple weirdos, are pollen collectors, and they collect pollen from flowers, and that's what they bring back to the nest instead of a wasp or a piece of barbecued pork off your sandwich, whatever it is that wasps are getting. And so because of that, they have very different features on their bodies. The main thing that I look for, first of all, is the flight pattern. Bees they truly are busy. Busy as a bee, it's a thing. And it's because every flower that they can get to, and that sort of still pollen that's not moving around or anything, if they can grab that and get it back to the nest and go get more and bring it back to the nest, the more often they do that, the more babies are made, the more successful the mama bee is. And so they fly a lot faster, whereas the wasp is more like a bird of prey or a mountain lion, and it's kind of always sort of looking to see where that next thing is, stopping for a drink of nectar and heading off to look again. So they tend to fly slower as you watch them. The wasps have much longer legs with these sort of spines on them that they use to hold onto and carry their prey, whereas the bees have these compact, really fast moving little bodies, often with a whole lot of hair on them to collect all of that pollen that they can shove into the hairs on their hind legs and take back. The wasp body tends to be more elongate and have much less hair on it, whereas the bee body is often shorter. And the distance between the thorax and the abdomen is much reduced. They're much closer together on most of our bees. Out where I am, one of the cool things with a lot of wasps, not all of them, but many of them, is they have sort of these metallic hairs on their face. And so when they're kind of rooting around on a flower and turn their heads, you can see that glisten in the sunlight. And that silver color tells me I'm looking at a wasp, because I'll never see that on a face of a bee. So that can also be helpful.
Okay, Amy and Jamie are both from the Southeast. So Jamie's wondering why North Carolina shows fewer bee species. And Amy just asked in general, why is the Southeastern US tend to be lower in that bee species map you presented?
That's a great question, and I'm not sure we know the entire answer. Part of the problem with science is that it's easy to make hypotheses, but to turn them into actual true facts that we know, we have to do some sort of cause and effect. And unless we could manipulate the entire Southeast and turn it into the Southwest and then watch bee species richness change, we can only kind of guess. The reason, first of all, that the Carolinas are so low is mostly because no one had done a complete comprehensive survey and published that information so that I could put it on there. I'm sure there are more bees there, but the published records were only showed that many. I believe, I want to say they're working on something right now. Maybe it's out now. That number eventually will be higher for sure. There's no question. It's just a matter of sampling effort and who's been out there collecting. So reasons that the Southeast might have fewer species include number one, these are all hypotheses, but one that I really think rings true is the ground, the soil in the southeast tends to be more compact and also wetter most of the time. And because of that, ground nesting bees struggle more with things like bacteria and mold and other stuff that might be in the ground. Whereas in the Southwest, the soils tend to be drier, they're more friable, it's easier for a bee to burrow in. It's also easier for the bee not to end up infected with bacteria and mold that grow in moist, dark conditions like a bee nest. And so I think there's an issue there that might help sort of determine the diversity of the two areas. But the other thing, and again, this is a hypothesis, is if you think about the Southwest, here's this area where, and you maybe have heard about this living in the Southeast, we occasionally have these banner years when all of the flowers are blooming and it's lovely and amazing. And the bees, of course, are all over everywhere. And then the next year there's no flowers or few flowers, they're all concentrated together and bees end up kind of isolated from each other. And if that happens enough, the chances for isolated populations to differ and become different species is much higher. Whereas in the Southeast, you have these populations that are a little more consistent in terms of being connected environments and less chance for speciation to occur. This is especially true among the really, really small bees. We have a bee out that's really common in the Southwest called Perdita, which is literally, I mean, it is itty bitty. It's the smallest bee in North America. And they don't fly very far, so it's very easy for them to become isolated from each other. And they represent 600 species in the Southwest. So it seems possible that sort of isolation has led to great speciation, and that might be part of the reason for our high numbers here. That was a long answer, sorry.
So let's finish up by having you help guide folks through ways that they can identify bees, whether that's community science projects that you recommend or apps, websites, kind of favorite places to go to ID. And then we'll come to give a little summary of the new book and how that can help as well.
Great. So number one, if you want to learn to identify bees, I would say is to spend some time becoming familiar with them. Go outside and look. You need that gestalt. You need that time with the bees. You need to be out kind of seeing them. And that really is a very important part. It's one thing to read a book, but you really need to spend some time walking around outside, kind of looking for them and learning to recognize their behaviors and that general thing. So know that that's going to be a requirement for anybody who wants to learn to identify bees well. My favorite places to go to figure out bee ID Well, so a couple things. Let's see, where do I begin? I'll start with the online stuff. So if you go online, Bug Guide is wonderful, and it's kind of a hidden gem. Bug Guide is really cool because you can post a picture and lots of bee sciencey expert sort of people will weigh in on what genus and what species they think that is. And oftentimes in the comments underneath, they'll put why they think it's that particular bee, which is a nice little sort of hint at what an expert is looking at in order to do BID. On that same website, you find taxonomy, so you can see what other species are in the area or what other species look similar and those sorts of things. So that can be a really nice place to sort of peruse and get a sense for different kinds of bees. I also really like Discover Life, especially if you live in the East. They have a lot of fairly good bee keys that don't require you to understand how to use a dichotomous key to make your way through, and they have pictures and stuff. So you can take your bee and it'll start with, is it yellow and black or green or fuzzy? And you can click the button and it'll eliminate everything that's not yellow and black and kind of help get you narrowed down to the bee that you might be looking at. And then when you get to species, they have range maps that are really nice. They have records of what plant it's been collected on, and they have the write-up, the scientific description of all of the characteristics of that bee, so you can kind of look at that and check it out. Those are my two favorite places. The Xerces Society and the Great Sunflower Project both have write-ups on different bee genera that you can read through and get a sense for sort of those larger groupings of bees. For bee species, there isn't much out there yet. I'm sure that's going to change in the future, but at the moment, there aren't a whole lot beyond that. Oh, wait. Canada has a really nice sort of write-up on bee species identification, and Florida has a decent one to get you to genus for bees that are in Florida. So those are worth checking out. When it comes to books, I mean, self-promotion isn't my thing, but reading The Bees in Your Backyard might be a place to start that could be helpful, and we put in there some keys. The book that we have coming out soon has a taxonomic key in the back that should help you get at least a genus, and then within there you might be able to take it further and get to the species level. There's also a lot of really cool courses right now you can sign up for around the US, different bee courses where you can take a workshop for a week and get a sense for how to identify the bees that are in your area. And I would recommend those to people.
Great, thanks, Olivia. And let me put a plug in for the project that you and I worked on, Bees of the Eastern U.S., Eastern Bees 101. Olivia created some wonderful videos during the pandemic on different common bee genera, and we're in the process of kind of revising a mini course that we'll put online, and all of you will find out about that when it's done. Work kind of fills in the cracks, so it gets hard to come back to. But if you enjoyed Olivia's presentation today, having her right in front of you with a video showing all of her amazing photographs and then taking quizzes so you can practice identification. It's really great. You feel like Olivia's right there working with you.